The continent lay vast and silent under the dawn of a new century, a prize suspended between empires. From the dense, ancient forests of the Atlantic coast, where the United States clung like a tenacious sapling, the land surged westward over the worn spine of the Appalachians. Beyond those mountains, the map dissolved into rumor and shadow, a sprawling, contested expanse where European flags were planted in distant forts, and the true power flowed in a single mighty river. That river was the Mississippi, a continental artery carving a muddy, meandering path from the northern wilderness to the warm Gulf of Mexico. For the young American Republic, it was not merely a geographical feature, it was the fragile thread upon which its survival west of the mountains was strung. Pioneers, farmers, and fur traders had pushed into the fertile valleys of Kentucky and Tennessee, their cabins dotting clearings in the boundless wood. Their lives, their prosperity, their very connection to the world depended on the river. They felled trees, packed furs, and barreled grain, sending it all on flatboats down the tributaries to the main channel. The current was their highway, carrying the wealth of the interior southward. But that highway had a single crucial toll gate, the port of New Orleans. Nestled on a crescent of silt 100 miles from the Gulf, the city was the valve through which all this American produce had to pass to reach the open sea and the markets of the world. And New Orleans in the year 1800 was not an American city. It was a Spanish possession, a colonial outpost of a fading empire, its flag a foreign standard flying over the nation's economic throat. The Republic's breath had been granted by a single sheet of parchment, Pinckney's Treaty of 1795. Within its diplomatic language lay a vital concession, the American right of deposit. This granted merchants from the United States the privilege to store their goods in New Orleans warehouses without paying exorbitant Spanish export duties. It was a temporary lease on life, a fragile agreement that acknowledged a stark, humiliating reality. The United States, for all its revolutionary fervor, was confined east of the Mississippi, its western destiny held hostage by a European crown. The treaty was the linchpin, and everyone from the log cabin homesteader to the president in his unfinished capital knew it. If that pin were pulled, the entire precarious structure of Western settlement would collapse into ruin and rebellion. The air in the east was thick with tension, a foreboding that whispered through the halls of government and the stockades of frontier settlements. To the north, British Canada loomed. To the south and west, the empires of Spain and increasingly the shadow of a resurgent France stretched across the map. The young nation was a vulnerable island in a European sea, its future growth choked by the simple, terrifying fact of geography. Control of New Orleans meant control of the continent's heart, and in the chancelleries of Europe, that control was a piece to be moved on a global board, its value calculated in crowns and armies, not in the survival of American farmers whose voices were barely a whisper on the wind. The crisis, when it came, arrived not with the roar of cannon, but with the dry rustle of a dispatch. In the still unfinished President's house in Washington, a place of mud and ambition, the report landed on Thomas Jefferson's desk like a physical weight. The Spanish intendant at New Orleans, acting on secret orders from Paris, had revoked the American right of deposit. The valve was shut, the artery was blocked. In the West, the reaction was immediate and volcanic. From Pittsburgh to Nashville, the outrage was a tangible force. Farmers saw their harvests, the wheat, the corn, the tobacco, rotting on riverbanks, their economic lifeline severed. Frontiersmen, their rifles never far from reach, spoke openly of raising militias to seize Orleans by force. In the halls of Congress, fiery representatives from beyond the mountains, the nascent war hawks, thundered about betrayal and demanded action. Their threats carried the sharp, dangerous edge of secession. If the Eastern government would not secure their survival, they would find a way themselves, even if it meant alliance with another power or a war that could shatter the fragile Union. The Republic's interior, its future, was threatening to tear itself loose. For President Jefferson, the philosopher-statesman, the news presented a profound and agonizing conflict. Seated in his book-lined study, the idealist in him recoiled. He envisioned an empire of liberty spreading westward, yes, but one cultivated by yeoman farmers, not secured by standing armies or entangling alliances. He despised the centralized power and militarism that the crisis now demanded. The thought of a powerful, ambitious France as a neighbor, with Napoleon's legions potentially garrisoning New Orleans, was a nightmare that struck at the core of his republican beliefs. Yet the pragmatist, the expansionist, knew inaction was suicide. The political stability of his administration and perhaps the Union itself hung in the balance. The prosperity of half a continent was at stake. His aversion to war and federal power clashed violently with the dire, immediate need to secure the national destiny. He was caught between his own principles and the cold exigencies of survival. The solution he settled upon was a desperate gambit, a narrow channel into which he poured the national panic. He would attempt to buy what he could not afford to take and might not be able to defend. He summoned James Monroe, a fellow Virginian trusted in the West, and gave him urgent instructions. Monroe was to sail to Paris to join the resident minister, Robert Livingston. Their mission to negotiate for the purchase of the city of New Orleans and, if possible, the Floridas. The authorization wrested from a reluctant Congress was up to $10 million, a staggering sum for a treasury still recovering from revolution. As Monroe's carriage rattled south toward Norfolk to board ship, the emotion in Washington was not one of confident strategy but of breathless uncertainty. They were sending a diplomat to bargain with an emperor armed with gold and little else, while at home the riverbanks filled with spoiling grain and the air crackled with the threat of insurrection. Jefferson had placed a bet on reason and commerce against the tides of empire and war. He stared at maps of the vast continent, his gaze fixed on the slender, vital crescent of the Mississippi's mouth, hoping a miracle of diplomacy could be purchased before the Republic's western flank exploded. The scene shifted across the Atlantic, from the anxious mud of Washington to the majestic stone of the Tuileries Palace. Here the air was not one of desperation, but of limitless ambition. In the gilded halls, Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of France, moved with the certitude of a master strategist surveying a global board. At the height of his power, his vision stretched beyond the battlefields of Europe to the verdant, untapped expanses of North America. On a map spread across a polished table, his finger traced a sweeping arc. The secret Treaty of San Ildefonso, signed in 1800 and finalized in 1802, had quietly returned the colossal territory of Louisiana from a weakened Spain to a resurgent France. To the European diplomats, it was a colonial transaction. To Napoleon, it was the cornerstone of a renewed empire. His gaze fixed on the Caribbean, on the pearl he intended to reclaim, Saint-Domingue, the sugar-rich colony now torn by revolution. His plan was elegant, brutal, and grand. The fertile plains of Louisiana, the imagined breadbasket of the New World, would feed the restored plantations of Saint-Domingue. Vast shipments of flour, meat, and timber would flow from New Orleans to Cap Français, sustaining the enslaved workforce that would rebuild France's most profitable colony. It would be a self-sustaining circuit, a French New World imperium that would balance the power of Britain and confine the upstart United States to the eastern seaboard forever. In the bustling ports of Brest and Toulon, the grand strategic move took physical form. Regiments of France's finest troops, the veterans of Italy and the Rhine, boarded a formidable armada. Under the command of his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, this expeditionary force was not merely a military contingent, it was the instrument of imperial resurrection. The soldiers, in their brilliant white uniforms and polished boots, marched up gangplanks with an air of invincibility, their flags snapping in the salt wind. From the quaysides, the spectacle looked like the deployment of a decisive weapon, a projection of power across thousands of miles of ocean. The ships, their holds packed with cannon and ambition, set sail for the tropics, carrying the weight of Napoleon's American design. In his study, surrounded by maps and reports, Napoleon calculated. He was aware of the American agitation over New Orleans, of the envoys they might send. They were a minor distraction, a petty republic squabbling over a single city. He held the entire hinterland, the key to the continent. Let them fret. Once Saint-Domingue was pacified and Louisiana settled, France would dictate terms from a position of unassailable strength. The troops sailing south were the guarantee. The gamble was immense, but the prize, a dominant French hemisphere, was worthy of the emperor he intended to become. The pieces were in motion, and in Paris, under the cold, calculating eye of ambition, the future seemed irrevocably French. The grand design met its execution not on orderly battlefields, but in a tropical hell. The scene shifted from the crisp order of Paris to the fever-drenched mountains and plantations of Saint-Domingue. Here, the Haitian Revolution was not a single battle, but a sprawling, multi-sided war of astonishing brutality, a furnace that consumed European armies. For years, the rebellion led by the brilliant strategist Toussaint Louverture had ground Spanish and British forces to dust. Now it was France's turn. General Leclerc's veterans, so formidable in Europe, found themselves in a nightmare. The rebel fighters, masters of guerrilla warfare, melted into the dense jungle, ambushing French columns from the shadows before vanishing into the steam. They burned the very plantations France sought to reclaim, preferring ashes to slavery. But a far more relentless enemy awaited the invaders, the mosquito. Yellow fever, the vomito negro, swept through the French ranks with impartial, horrific efficiency. The disease did not discriminate between a fresh conscript and a decorated colonel. Men in their pristine white uniforms would stagger on parade, their skin jaundiced, before collapsing to vomit black blood. Field. Hospitals became charnel houses. The heat, oppressive and damp, baked the unburied dead. The visual was not of heroic combat, but of systemic collapse, soldiers shivering with chills in the sweltering noon, their eyes sunken, their grand conquest reduced to a fight for a single next breath. In the Tuileries, the reports that reached Napoleon's desk transformed from optimistic bulletins into grim, relentless ledgers of annihilation. Casualty figures mounted into the tens of thousands. Leclerc himself succumbed to the fever, his body shipped back to France in a cask of rum. The expeditionary force, the decisive weapon, was being erased not by enemy steel but by an invisible, indifferent foe. The cost was staggering, not just in men but in treasure and strategic purpose. Napoleon studied the final, devastating arithmetic in the cold light of pragmatism. The calculation, once so elegant, now lay in ruins. Without Saint-Domingue, the profitable sugar engine, the vast territory of Louisiana, was not an asset but a liability. It was a distant, indefensible tract of wilderness that would drain French coffers for no return. Furthermore, the Peace of Amiens with Britain was crumbling, war with the Royal Navy was imminent. He knew he could never defend New Orleans, let alone the entire Mississippi Valley, from British warships. To hold Louisiana was to invite a British seizure that would fund his enemies. The American dream evaporated in the face of Caribbean reality. His brother-in-law was dead, his army was gone, and his treasury was bleeding. A new, colder calculation took its place. He could cut his losses, turn a liability into an asset, and use the sale to fund his imminent European campaigns. Better still, he could place the territory into the hands of a weak, neutral power, the United States, denying it forever to his British rivals. The pivot was swift and absolute. The master strategist, confronted with a checkmate he had not foreseen, prepared a stunning countermove. As the last of his soldiers fell in the Haitian heat, Napoleon summoned his finance minister, François Barbé-Marbois. The instructions were simple, breathtaking in their scale. The entire territory of Louisiana, not merely the city of New Orleans, was to be offered for sale. The American envoys, Livingston and the newly arrived Monroe, were coming to Paris to buy a key. They would find the door to the entire continent thrown open, its price a bargain for an emperor who had already turned his gaze back to the battlefields of Europe. The gamble had failed, but in its failure, it had set the stage for an American miracle.